It is April 29 and 30, 1975, and South Vietnam is falling. The U.S. is evacuating South Vietnamese from Saigon. Here, a South Vietnamese Air Force pilot with his wife has escaped the mainland and is buzzing the deck of the USS Midway seeking clearance to land. Here, former Vice President of South Vietnam Nguyen Cao Ky walks from the anti-submarine warfare helicopter. Thank you for joining me. In April 1975, as the North Vietnamese were laying siege to Tan Son Nhut Airport and Saigon was falling, hundreds of South Vietnamese Air Force pilots jumped into whatever aircraft they could find and escaped, some with their families, by flying into Thailand, primarily into the Royal Thai Naval Base at Utapao. Retired U.S. Air Force pilot Roger Youngblood witnessed the exodus, and today he's going to tell us about this event in a video interview I did with him. U.S. Air Force Brigadier General Harry Heine Aderholt, who commanded the U.S. military's assistance and advisory operations in Thailand, saw way back in 1973 that the ultimate benefactors of U.S. military aid to the South Vietnamese would be the North Vietnamese. And he wanted to reclaim as many airplanes as he could for the United States and its allies. So now, here in 1975, when things are falling apart, he gave Youngblood and U.S. Air Force Major Jack W. Drummond, a pilot, a critical mission: save U.S. aircraft by flying them out of Utapao. In the beginning of 1975, Aderholt had sought permission from the U.S. Embassy in Saigon to begin bringing the aircraft out of Vietnam. He had no authority himself to remove assets that had been loaned under the Military Assistance Program. After U.S. forces withdrew from Vietnam in 1973, military decisions there were made by the State Department. Aderholt presented a plan to U.S. Ambassador Graham A. Martin for the evacuation of U.S. supplied aircraft in the early months of 1975. But Martin said the plan was defeatist and denied it. A few months later, as Saigon was falling, Aderholt learned that the Hanoi government's first move would be to send a delegation to Thailand to inventory the escaped Vietnamese aircraft. So the Thai government ordered these aircraft impounded to stay in place. The aircraft were military assistance program assets and as such still belonged to the U.S. government. But Aderholt wasn't sure he could count on the Thai to see it that way. He did have close relations with the Thai. So without authority to do so, Aderholt gave 5 F-5A aircraft from Vietnam to Air Chief Marshal of the Royal Thai Air Force to get the Thai military on his side. Although the U.S. Embassy, in negotiation with the Thais and the North Vietnamese, was responsible for the final disposition of aircraft, Aderholt knew it would be difficult for the State Department to take back the gift from the Thai. Aderholt then learned that the USS Midway was on its way to Utapao and was to load the most valuable Vietnamese aircraft currently at the airport. Loading only the most valuable U.S. aircraft meant that the older combat aircraft, like the A-1 Skyraiders, would be left behind. These propeller-driven aircraft had proven effective in close air support and rescue operations, and Aderholt was not about to let the few remaining A1s fall into communist hands. With the blessing of the Thai military, Aderholt ordered Youngblood and Major Jack W. Drummond, both pilots who had flown Skyraiders years before, to save the A1s. Let's hear from Youngblood now.
This was in 73 and then into 74, and things were getting a little tough. And we had signed this peace treaty, Paris Accord, in 73, and we had turned over just a ton of airplanes to the South Vietnamese Air Force. In fact, at sometime in 73, when all that had taken place, the South Vietnamese Air Force had grown to 2,276 aircraft, and they were the fourth largest air force in the world. I mean, this was something else. We had turned over everything from F5s, A37s. We'd given them A1s, AC-119, C7s, C47s, O1s. Things were going bad for the South Vietnamese. And the North Vietnamese started coming south in late 74 and 75. And I was getting a phone call fairly often from General Aderholt. And he said, well, he says, things are not going good. I'm working on the Cambodian Air Force to try to get those folks out of Cambodia. I'm working with the ambassador there to get them over to Utapao before the Pathet Lao and the Cambodians, Khmer Rouge, come down and take over the place. And he said, I've got a good plan. And it was a good plan. And General Aderholt, again, he saved a lot of lives. Let's just be straight about it. His plan in Cambodia was about 97 airplanes got out of Cambodia and hundreds and hundreds of people. And he had gone to the ambassador and he had told him, he said, look, he said, you know, and I know, and the CIA is telling you that this is not going well. And he said, I got a way to save a lot of people and a lot of airplanes. And the ambassador said, well, tell me about your plan. And I'll take a moment to tell you, he had all the T-28s there in Cambodia loaded up with munitions. And they were going to go out to a strike target up north of Phnom Penh. And the thing was that was beautiful was Aderholt had buses load up all the families of the Cambodian pilots and the Cambodian officers and military people there. And they trucked them west to, I think it was a place called Battambang. And there in Battambang, all the families were. And then the pilots took off out of various places in Cambodia and bombed the Khmer Rouge. They recovered into Battambang. Now, the trick of all this, which was just unbelievable, was they reloaded all the T-28s with bombs, but they also put their families in the back seat. So here they took off on a mission, and they went back over the Khmer Rouge, bombing as much as they could, dropping everything they had. They had their families in the back seat, and then they RTB'd or returned into Thailand and landed at Utapao. So there was the Cambodian Air Force sitting on the ground in Utapao about a month before Saigon stuff hit the fan, and they escaped to Utapao. How I was getting involved in all this soon turned out to be a true Wild West show. Utapao at the time had 20 B-52s still parked on the ramp. There was a Thai detachment Air Force. The Navy had a couple of birds there, the Thai Navy. The Cambodian Air Force was there, and soon the South Vietnamese Air Force was there. And the thing was that nobody could talk to each other. So here was a SAC commander who goes by the book, trying to understand how he's going to take all these refugees, all these airplanes, and everything. It only got worse on April the 29th when Saigon fell and all the hundreds of airplanes came out of South Vietnam. So General Aderholt was hands-on and all that. The problem, which was a serious mistake by the South Vietnamese ambassador, Graham, I think it was at the time, Aderholt presented him a plan on how to save thousands of lives and a lot of the military assistant aircraft that we had given him. And he just turned it down to General Aderholt. And he said, no, he said that would be a significant sign of defeat. And he said, we're not going to do that. Well, he was packing his bags and taking the flag down from the embassy and getting out of town just a few weeks after that. And had they listened to General Aderholt, a lot of people would have been saved. We saved a lot. There was thousands of people that came out of South Vietnam on 141 flights, and those that escaped and went to Utapao. It was wonderful. During my assignment to Kokatiem as an advisor to the AU-23 squadron.
During this time, Youngblood was a U.S. advisor to the Thai AU-23 aircraft squadron at Koh Katiem Royal Thai Air Force Base, Lopburi. Here, Youngblood is shown at Koh Katiem with an AT-28 and AU-23. According to the Bangkok Post, in November 2022, the U.S. gave Thailand 33 of the single-prop AU-23As in 1972, and 12 are still flying, the only active fleet of their kind in the world, so said the Thai military according to the article.
I got a call from General Aderholt, and I think it was sometime in 74. And he said, don't be surprised if you see a strange airplane land up there. And he said, I've got some work for you to do. You need to train these pilots. He didn't really say what it was about, I guess for security purposes on the phone or whatever. But a couple of days later, the AU-24 landed, and I got a call from the Thai commander, and he said, do you know anything about this? And I said, well, I did get a heads up that maybe there would be an airplane land, and the people wanted to talk to me, but I don't know where they're from. He said, well, they're from Cambodia. And he said, it's an AU-24. And he said, if you will, go out there and see what's going on. I said, okay. So I went out to the airplane, and these two Cambodian pilots got out, and they had a gunner with them, a sergeant that operates the gun. The airplane, the 24, was built exactly like the AU-23 with a XM-197 Guilin gun out the left side. So sure enough, those two Cambodian pilots got out of their AU-24 and with this American-looking person who was American, and he was with the agency, and they come over, and of course they couldn't speak English hardly at all. So they spoke Cambodian and French, and this accompanying agency individual spoke English, of course, and French and Cambodian. And he told me, he said, I want you to train these guys how to fire this gun in a 30-degree bank, and for the people in the Air Force in Cambodia to use these AU-24s that they were given. He said, but they don't know how to shoot it, and there's no one there to train them. And he said, I know you're training the AU-23 pilots here at Shandy Range. And I said, well, yeah. So I got that all cleared through the Thai base commander that we could use the range, we could train them for a week and all. So it was a little, not awkward, but kind of funny. I was in the right seat and they're in the left seat. And I told the guys, he pulled his chair up between us and just right behind us. And I said, I want to tell you something. I said, when I tell this pilot that I got it, if he gets it into a situation where I need to take over the control of the airplane, he said, you better tell him real fast in French. So I would speak in English, and the agency dude would speak in French to the Cambodian pilot. And there we went for a whole week training out at Shandy Range, how to shoot the gun, how to fly the airplane better, and et cetera. So that was just a small instance of where General Aderholt brought people over from Cambodia to train in Thailand at their range, and they went back. And it was fortunate that General Aderholt was able to get most of those people out of there. We didn't get any. I think we got one or two AU-24s out before the fall of Cambodia, but it was just another under the table, over the table, whatever you want to call it, deal that General Aderholt was working. He just did more behind the scenes for the war in Asia than anyone will ever know. So as I went on with my training there at Kokatiem, the Thai base commander said, look, he said, they have their own intel and CIA, so to speak. He said he's been getting a lot of phone calls that he needs to be ready for something happening, people coming out of Cambodia, or maybe things in Vietnam are not going along well, and so his government, the Thai government, had notified him that, hey, we need to be on alert that the North Vietnamese are moving south. I got calls from Just Mag also saying, uh, especially early on in '75, that they were going to try to make one last stand, and they were going to do the best they could against the North Vietnamese. But the North Vietnamese had taken over 933 South Vietnamese airplanes as they came south. So as they came through the airfields and helicopter pads and all moving south, they captured 933 airplanes. And they were destined and wanting to take Saigon, of course. So the plan, which Aderholt had tried to get the ambassador to South Vietnam to go along with, how to get as many people out as he could, wasn't working. And so on April the 29th, the rockets started to fall on Saigon and Tan Son Nhut. And at that time, it was just a Wild West show again, as the pilots ran to anything that would crank. And if it had gas in it, they tried to get off the ground. And they had talked among themselves, as I found out, to head west and try to get into Utapao. At that time, General Aderholt called me and he said, I want you to get Jack Drummond, who's working for Just Mag in Bangkok at the time. And he said, he flew the A1. And he said, I know you flew the A1. He said, I want you to go down to Utapao, find out what's going on.
The A-1 Skyraider originated in 1945 as a carrier-based torpedo and dive bomber and was the first single-seat torpedo dive bomber to serve with the Navy. Later, the Navy decided to get rid of them, and the Air Force took them, recognizing the A-1 as the type of bomber that would work well in Vietnam and Laos. According to Youngblood, 3,180 were built. The U.S. Air Force lost 191 during the war, the Navy 65, and Vietnamese losses are unknown. Today, only 4 are known to exist, all in museums.
And see if you can help them out. Well, I took a Porter or an AU-23 and I went down to Bangkok at Don Muang. I got Jack and he wanted to get checked out in the AU-23, so we flew on down to Utapao and we did 3 touch and goes, and I signed him off as a pilot. So if he wanted to fly back to Don Muang, he could on his own or whatever. I mean, he's an excellent pilot. And so I picked up a Vietnamese pilot. I don't know where he came from. And I put him in the right seat. And so we took off and went down to Trot, which is in the southeast corner of Thailand. We landed on a grass field there. There was sort of an Army helicopter field. And I talked to the people that were starting to come out. They'd gotten a few helicopters out. People were starting to escape from South Vietnam. They saw the writing on the wall. So I got him in the airplane. I got him on a frequency that he thought that most of the Vietnamese planes would be monitoring. And he started giving him directions and just broadcasting in the blind to anybody that would hear him to come to Utapao. And that was going to be the base of refuge for the for the Vietnamese Air Force. And he had some people contact him back. And the thing was fuel. Most of the helicopters were landing in rice paddies and whatever. Some even landed in Cambodia on the beach and just got out and turned themselves over to the police or whomever trying to get out of Vietnam. One incident that happened was an A-37 pilot got out of South Vietnam, headed west to Utapao, and was low on gas, and he saw a highway, and so he just circled around, dropped his gear, and set it down on the highway, and he was loaded with Mark 82s at the time. And he taxied to a stop. Of course, it just created a big commotion, and he saw a school. And the school had this huge opening where people drove in and parked their cars and all that. So he just taxis his A-37 into the schoolyard and shuts it down. And of course, that was quite a learning exercise for the students. But the police came and then they called the Thai government, and the Thai government called Just Mag, and Aderholt then got on the phone and he helicoptered down a de-arming crew from Udon to download the bombs and clear the munitions out of the gun and all this. And the airplane got put on a truck and towed back down to, or trucked back down to Utapao. But that's just one of the things that happened. O1s landed in the same fashion on dirt roads and everything. So if you ran out of gas, you had to try to put it down somewhere.
Youngblood said Aderholt began pre-positioning 55-gallon drums of aviation fuel at Trat and other places in southeast Thailand, so upon landing the planes could refuel. Smaller craft such as O-1s, helicopters, and others took a decidedly more southwest route to get out of Cambodian airspace quicker and then turn northeast, searching for the small grassy strip in Trat, many landing on roads, beaches, and in rice paddies.
So as I got down to Trot and I flew around with the lieutenant, I had an interesting incident that happened just as the things really went to heck in a handbasket. A helicopter landed there at Trot. And it really dawned on me then what was happening. An elderly lady, which I found out was about 95 years old, got out of the helicopter in her black ao dai. Now, the ao dai is the dress that the South Vietnamese wear, women. And she was carrying a plastic bag, holding it in front of her. And at the same time, a young girl got out of the airplane holding a baby. And so I just was there, and I asked the pilot that was with me, the Vietnamese pilot, who I could speak a little bit of English. I said, "Who is that and where are they from?" He said, "Oh, they came out of Bintui or Kanto or somewhere," he was talking about. And I said, "Well, what's that elderly lady in the black dress? What's she got?" He went over and looked at her, and here's this 97-year-old lady, I found out, who left her life in Vietnam, and the one thing she brought out with her was a goldfish. And that fish was in that bag, in that water. And I know she had it probably all her life for a long time, and she wasn't leaving it behind. And that was just remarkable to me. And then he talked to the young girl. She was 17 years old, and she was carrying her 4-day-old baby. So here was the 97-year-old and a 17-year-old with a 4-day-old baby, which was it just showed me what was happening in life. And Saigon was to be no more. South Vietnam was to be no more. But life goes on, and it did with these people. And they were trying to escape with their lives, much like the Cambodian T-28 pilots that put their families in the back seat and they went out, bombs loaded, dropped their bombs, and then RTB to return to Utapao, recovered to Utapao, and their families got out. During the fall of Saigon, many A1s and many other aircraft escaped to Utapao. Well, in that was 11 A1s, a couple of A1Es, most were single-seat A1s, H's and J's. So Aderholt had told Jack Drummond and I to go down to Utapao, and he said, "See what you can find out about the A1s." And he says, "I have a plan to literally steal all the F-5s and A-37s. And that plan came about by him going to the Air Chief Marshal of the Air Force, Thai Air Force, and saying, "I will give you 4 or 5 brand new F-5s. And most of the F-5s had just come off the showroom floor, and they had less than 100 hours. And so that brightened the eyes of this Air Chief Marshal. And he said, "Now, let me get this straight." He says, Aderholt told me the story that said, "You're going to give me 5 F-5s, brand new?" I said, "Yeah." He said, and Aderholt said, "I want to put all the F-5s and A-37s on the Midway." At that time, the Midway had taxied up, so to speak, to the shoreline there south of Utapao. And his plan was to recover all the U.S. military assistant aircraft that he could and get them out of there before the North Vietnamese came over, and the Thais would have just said, "Okay, you can have them back." Well, Aderholt wasn't dealing with that. So his plan was going on while I was looking at the A1s with Jack Drummond, and he was picking up every F-5 he could and either sling loading it or putting it on a truck or some way getting it over to the Midway and loading it on the Midway. And out of 165 South Vietnamese airplanes that flew out of South Vietnam to Utapao. And if you can imagine an additional 165 airplanes sitting on the grass, the ramp, everywhere. There was airplanes landing on both ends of the runways. Like I saw a C-47 try to land, and a Caribou or something was landing on the other end because they had no contact with the flight or the tower, so it was a mess. But luckily, a lot of people didn't get killed. But 165 airplanes came out of there on 29 April and landed, and out of those 11 A1s. So Jack Drummond and I got down there and we looked at these A1s and we said, well, they look like they can fly. The problem was we didn't have any de-arming crews. They didn't carry any bombs, but the 4 20-millimeter guns in the wings, we didn't have any pins to put in, so we didn't know if they were live or not. Well, that was late in the afternoon, so we came back the next day, and that evening, they had pushed all the A1s off the taxiways into a ditch. And when they built Utapao, it's just flat, right on the beach, so to speak. They had to prepare the taxiways and the runway, which was 12,000 foot long, for B-52s, which was the heaviest airplane we had in Vietnam. And so they dug these ditches along the edge of the runway and the edge of the taxiway. And the ditches were pretty deep because they needed to use the dirt to build up the taxiways and runway. We got back the next morning, and this was like the 4th of May, 1975. And we went out and looked at the A1s, and they had been pushed in the ditch. Well, it had rained heavy that previous day, actually, and then that night. And the wheels, the tires of the A1s were literally underwater. And they were all parked in a row down the ditch, 11 A1s in the ditch, underwater, the wheels. So we looked at those and we got with the Chief Master Sergeant. I forget his name, I think it was Day. And I said, can you get those A1s up out of the water onto the edge of the grass here, the taxiway? And I said, if you can, we want to take a look at them and we're going to try to get as many of them as we can out. And he shook his head and he said, yeah, I'll try to do that. So he got a truck and a tow bar and all, and he started pulling them out and all. And as they came out, the first one he pulled out was tail number 332, and the next one was the E model, which was 683. So we got to looking at those, and Jack and I had this idea, we're going to get into the E model and we're going to fly around and get to know the airplane again. And just as a side note, when Aderholt told us to go down and check out these A1s and if we could get any of them cranked to fly them up to Tok Lee. Back in the day, Aderholt had worked with the CIA and he had built a special hangar at Tok Lee, which was huge, and it would house the U-2. And he said, I want you to put as many A1s as you can in this hangar at Tok Lee. And of course, he had greased the skids with the ties, and they knew we were coming if we could fly them. And so we went up and got on the wing of the E model. We looked in, and there was no stick in the right seat. And I told Jack, I said, well, I'm not sitting in that seat. I said, you can, but I'm not. And he said, no, I'm not. So that idea of driving the airplane around the airfield and getting to know the airplane again was out the door. But the funny thing was when Aderholt told us to do this, he says, you remember, he said, I remember you flew the A1 about 3 years ago. I said, yes, sir. And Jack flew it 5 years ago. And he said, have you ever ridden a bicycle? And I said, yeah, why? And he said, well, do you think you could ride one again? I said, yeah. And he said, well, get your butt down to Utapao and crank those A1s up. He said, you'll learn how. He said, you flew it. You'll know exactly how to fly it. Just get them up to Tok Lee. So I thought that was interesting, and it's true. But if you can imagine today, as I say in today's Air Force, if you went out to some airfield and you hadn't flown an F-15 for a few years and you decided to get in the cockpit and turn the power on and see if you could crank it up and go fly it, you'd probably be shot before you got into the cockpit. But if you did get it, you'd be court-martialed or whatever. But that wasn't the way it was back in Utapao. That was a Wild West show. And Aderholt said, go get in the airplane and fly it. And we didn't even have a second thought about that. We got in those airplanes and we talked about it before we cranked them up. And Jack was in 332. I was in the E model. And we talked about where to set the throttle and the prop lever and the mixture lever. And we remembered to count 16 blades across the top and then go to both mags. It had two spark plugs in each cylinder, A and B. And so then you turn both of them on. And you had to understand that those airplanes had just flown out of Vietnam. They'd been flying combat. So it wasn't like they were in storage for a long period of time. We decided we could crank them up, and we said, well, what are we going to do here? What's our call sign? So we decided to use Sandy 1 and 2 as our call sign, which was kind of significant. As we taxied out that day, we taxied by 2 Jolly Greens, which were sitting alert, and we saluted them and they saluted us. And that was a statement. The day before, we'd gone into base ops and talked to them about taxiing the airplanes around and flying them around the airfield and seeing, just checking them out. And they said, well, we'll need authorization before you can fly anything out of here. And I understood that. So I got on the phone with Aderholt. He got on the phone with the base commander at Utapao. And within about an hour, we had a sign-out sheet at base ops where we could sign out and fly anything we wanted to out of Utapao. But we were only interested in the A1, so that took care of that. And so we got the airplanes cranked up, finally got them cranked up. And Jack and I had decided about the direction to go to Tockley. And we're going to fly at about 1,500 foot BFR. And when we got up on the airplanes initially to check them out, because the canopies had been open the night before, I reached in and pushed my hand down on the seat and the water came up because it was soaking wet. The seat was soaking wet. And the parachute of the emergency system, Yankee extraction system in the A1 was in the seat. Well, silk doesn't open up and fly very well soaking wet. So we both decided we'd leave the pin in the seat and we would fly it that way. And if the engine quit or we had a problem, we would either drop the gear and land on a highway, or we would belly it into an airfield, or not airfield, but a rice paddy. And so we flew with the canopy open all the way to Tockley. It was kind of interesting, but here we were after 3, 4, 5 years, and we're flying 2 A1s back up to Tockley. It was, as I think back now, it was amazing that, but we didn't think anything about it. And that was the point. Aderholt wanted us to do it, and we did it. So we taxied out and we took off, and as Jack got airborne, he said, I'm fine. And I said, yeah, we were afraid of the brakes because the gear had been underwater all night. So we decided to go ahead and raise the gear, and we did. And I joined up into kind of a root position on Jack and a little bit above him so I could look through his airplane in case something's fallen off or had a problem. And so we flew up there, and we came down initial at Tockley, and we had gotten the tower frequency from Utapao and all, so we called initial, and we pitched out and landed Sandy 1, Sandy 2, and taxied in, and we handed the airplane over to the base commander at Tockley, or both A1s. Well, Aderholt had called the Army, and he had gotten the fixed wing, sort of like a Beech King Air. The Army had some U-21s or something in the area. So they flew up there to pick us up and bring us back to Utapao. And, of course, we'd been talking on the Fox mic all the way up there about how to do this and that and going over things, keeping the needle in the green. And as long as we were running okay, we were all right and all. And we got on the airplane with the Army guy, and he looked back at us, the AC, and he said, I never heard two pilots talk about how to fly the airplane as they were flying the airplane. And I said, well, that's the way it was. He was on our Fox mic with us.
As Youngblood and Drummond started to fly the last 2 A1s out of Utapao on the second day, the SAC commander asked them when it was they had gotten current on the A1, which they used to fly. They replied, yesterday. And the SAC commander just shook his head.
So he took us back to Utapao, and it was late in the afternoon, so we decided to spend the night and then get up the next morning. And on the 6th of May, Jack and I went out, and that's when Jack flew 665 and I flew 606. And we cranked them up, taxied out, took off, and went up to Tockley. And a funny note was that as we went down initially and pitched out, we had painted out all the Vietnamese insignias and everything, and we were on official orders by General Aderholt to fly the airplane. So this was a U.S. Air Force mission, and it kind of dawned on us that this was probably the last day that the Air Force would ever fly an A-1, and it was, and it came out to be that way. So as I turned base and Jack was touchdown and was rolling out, I said, "Jack, you down?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, I guess I'm the last A-1 pilot to fly the A-1 in the U.S. Air Force." That was kind of funny. It just sort of a joke, but wound up being that way. So I landed 606, and 606 over the years wound up at Addison, Texas, at the Cavanaugh Air Museum, and I give a shout out to Ken Holston, who flew the airplane along with other A1 pilots there at Cavanaugh. But he was a combat pilot from Desert Storm, and he was associated with Cavanaugh and got checked out in the E model they had, and then the H model 606, and flew it a lot. And he was very instrumental in getting Delta, as he was a Delta captain. He got Delta's paint shop to repaint 606 into the exact colors and markings that we had in Vietnam. And my hat's off to Ken for doing that. And as we finished up that day and we went back down to Utapao, the base commander at SAC there came out and met us, and he says, "You guys got a phone call in base ops." So we went in there, and it was Aderholt, and he said, "Well, the State Department found out that I was stealing all the F-5s and A-37s, and they're already on the Midway." And he said, "There's nothing they can do about that. But they shut down my operation for stealing these A-1s." And he said, "You guys can return to duty," so to speak. So we did, but it was an unbelievable time working for Aderholt. Like I said, the greatest commander I had, and I'll never forget that man. And when the airplanes got up to Tockley, just as an afterthought here, he found a way to get them put on trucks, 4 A1s on trucks, and had the wings at the fold of the wings, had them removed and took them over and put them on rice barges at the Chapia River. He had loaded them up, had to cut holes in the sides of the rice barge so the wings would sit down in the rice barge. They were a little bit narrow.
According to this Smithsonian Air and Space magazine article, which you can read online, called Escape to Utapao, Aderholt had the 4 barges brought up from Bangkok port, and after loading the A1s, the barges immediately got mired in shallows. Aderholt bribed the keeper of the Chai Net Dam with 20,000 baht, the equivalent of 1,000 US dollars at the time, to open the floodgates. The barges then floated downriver to the port of Bangkok.
And then he floated them all the way down to Bangkok. He found a Russian trawler, a Russian boat that he would pay to load the A1s on, and they floated those A1s over to California, to Los Angeles or somewhere thereabouts. So it was kind of funny that we'd been fighting the Vietnam War against the North Vietnamese who were using Russian SAMs, and now we've got 4 A1s on a Russian boat that's floating them over to California for us. 606 went to Cavanaugh Air Museum in Addison, Texas.
The Cavanaugh Museum is currently closed to the public, but the airplanes are still owned by the museum. 606 is being stored in Sherman, Texas at the old Perrin Air Force Base.
665 went to the Tennessee Air Museum in Sevierville, Tennessee, where Neil and Rhonda Melton have kept that airplane in flying condition, and my hat's off to them for doing so. It's not cheap, and it's a great on display at that museum, and I encourage everyone to go to the Tennessee Air Museum and see all the aircraft they have there. 683 wound up in Colorado Springs, I think, at an air museum there. It's still flying today by the people that purchased it. 332's in the Smithsonian. It needs parts to fly again. For some reason, I'm not sure exactly what the story is there, but it probably could be rehabilitated and flown again. But those four A1s, thanks to General Aderholt, wound up back in the United States.
3 of the A1s are still flyable today. A reunion was organized in 2019 in Colorado, and the 3 A1s flew together. Here is Roger meeting the owner of A1 683 and seeing it for the first time in 45 years. Here is the last picture of Youngblood and Drummond together.
I'm just thankful for ever working for General Aderholt and knowing the story behind General Aderholt. And as I said, if you ever have the chance to get a hold of this book, Air Commando 1, you would never go wrong in buying this book and reading it. And it was a true hero, a true warrior in Asia. And there's many good write-ups on the cover and all about what a true warrior he was and how many lives he actually saved.
Roger Youngblood has additional stories to tell regarding the war. Stand by for his future video coming soon.